For those of you who are unfamiliar, my name is Lankford, and I'm from the Joplin, Missouri area. I attend the Leawood Village Church of Christ in Joplin. I'm thankful to be one of your speakers for this weekend. The theme for this weekend is a very timely one, and that is the theme of peer pressure. And peer pressure, of course, we all know what that is. That's when you're around people, whether they be of your age or your community or even your faith, and those people tend to influence you and your actions and your behaviors. They might even, when you're around certain people, convince you to do things that you certainly wouldn't do if it was just you. So our peers have a great influence over not only how we act around them, but how we act when we leave them and how we act around the people that we usually wouldn't act that way. For example, if I were to go and spend time with my school friends and pick up a bad behavior, I will carry that into the rest of my life. So we need to be very careful with the people that we surround ourselves with. All that being said, you are in one of, if not the best places to be this Friday evening, and that is in the house of the Lord. So without doing anything further, that's really introduced just the theme for the whole weekend. But now we're going to get into my specific topic. So what I was assigned, or what I chose rather, was the idea of maintaining and sharing our faith. We talk about our faith and talking with the people around us about our religion. It's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to bring up in our society religion and the topic of God or any form of God or any church or any form of a church. And when you start talking to those people, it becomes uncomfortable and you don't know what to say because you don't put yourself in that situation often. So we often kind of shy away and say, I'll talk to you later, or I'll get back to you when I understand it a little better. And there's some merit to that, but we're going to be really discussing this idea of having an identity crisis when our two worlds collide and those situational pressures convince us to not share our faith. So the question I'd like to pose to you is, how do we share and be a light in a world that wants us to conform to culture and accept all definitions of morality? What do I mean when I say our faith? Well, when I say faith in this context, I mean our beliefs and our practices and our convictions. And those are a result of God working through us. Penn Jillette is a very outspoken atheist, and he's in the entertainment industry, but he spoke this in 2009, and I think this is a good way to introduce our thoughts. And this was in reference to a man who had handed him a Bible after a comedy show or something of that sort. But Penn said this: if you believe that there's a heaven and hell and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life or whatever, and you think that it's not really worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward, an atheist who think that people shouldn't proselytize, just leave me alone, keep your religion to yourself. How much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? And to proselytize is just to convert somebody. How much do you have to hate somebody to believe that everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? If I believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that a truck was coming at you and you didn't believe it, and that truck was bearing down on you, there's a certain point where I would tackle you. And this is more important than that. An atheist recognized that, so certainly we can recognize those same comments. Number one, let's talk about this idea of choosing not to share our faith. We often get feelings of nervousness leading into a conversation, awkwardness during one, and regret going out of it. So I'd like to turn to an Old Testament passage that I think covers this very well. When we talk about common excuses, one of the main ones is I'm not really comfortable talking about my faith. I'd like to talk to you about three men who were comfortable talking about their faith. They're often said in the order Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but I was talking with Carter, and he said I should say that in a different order to get your attention, but I'm not going to do that. So anyways, Daniel 3, verses 14 through 18, if you'll turn there at this time. Daniel 3 and verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image that I have set up?" This is, of course, the time when Israel was in captivity in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar has made an idol, and he's the king of Babylon. And he has made a gold idol, and he has demanded that the Jews would bow down to it, and that all men everywhere would be unfaithful to the true God. So their position in this chapter says quite a bit about who these men were. See, in chapter 1 it says that there were none like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. They were Hebrew servants to the king, and they were even 10 times better than the astrologers and magicians. So now these high up people in the kingdom are at odds with the king whom they serve, but they are not at odds with the true king who they serve. And then in verse 15, now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? This is, of course, the very popular story of the fiery furnace. And if you read on later in the chapter, it talks about how even the men around the furnace, not those who were inside of it, around it were burned and they died. So essentially, the king is giving them two options, to turn or to burn. And that is all that they have to choose from. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up. Not only were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aware of the consequences of their actions, they were accepting of those consequences. They knew what the outcome would be, and they said, okay, we're still going to do it. That's how we ought to be today. Whether ridicule or persecution, whatever the case is, we have to mentally prepare ourselves and tell ourselves that something is going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that there is going to be reaction, and I'm prepared no matter what the reaction is. We should understand that God will either deliver us in death or out of death if it comes to persecution. That's what these men understood. See, we have a higher deliverance waiting. So when we mentally prepare ourselves for the consequences of our actions, then we are mentally prepared for the situation that we are walking into. Romans 1 and verse 16, as we just read in our song, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. Paul said this statement. We all know who Paul is. In Paul's life, the apostle, of course, he was banished, he was ridiculed, he was imprisoned, and eventually history tells us he was killed for his faith. He died. He was martyred. Still, after the many years of his preaching, he was not ashamed to call Christ his Lord. He was not ashamed of the power of the gospel because he understood that power. He'd seen men of all sorts and women of all sorts be saved. He'd seen that for a great deal of his life, and still, he was not ashamed. In preparation for this lesson, I picked up a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs, and I didn't go through the whole book. I just read really the first chapter. But you'll be surprised some of the things that you read in there. Christian history is littered with the blood of martyrs and persecutions of those professing to follow Christ. See, it was very common for crucifixions, stonings, beheadings, imprisonments, beatings, and not to mention all the ridicule and mockery and more. Are we really willing to say that we're not willing to talk to somebody about our faith because it's going to be awkward? Because we're going to be nervous? Those people weren't nervous. They shared their faith because it was the right thing to do. And because of it, they will be rewarded if they faithfully serve God. Another common excuse that people bring up is, I'm just not the right person for that. You should go talk to my preacher, or you should go talk to somebody else. And I think there is something to be said for saying, well, I don't know that right now. That's okay. It's all right to say, I don't know. Those are my 3 favorite words in the English language. But we often use this excuse of, I'm not a preacher, or I'm not a man, or I'm not bold. I'm just not the right person at the right time for this. Come back to me at a later time. Exodus 3 and 4, there is a very biblical example of somebody who had this exact attitude, and that is Moses. Moses is a very common person for people in the world to know about because of all the great things that he did. But Moses was a self-doubter. He did not believe in himself at all. And for some reason, God chose him. We're going to get into that right now. So if we turn over to Exodus 3 and 4, I'm going to read a few verses from there. So of course we understand that Moses makes several excuses. And then in this context, this is God talking to him at the burning bush. And he has chosen Moses to lead the enslaved Israel out of Egypt. In chapter 3 and verse 11, it says this. Moses says this. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children out of Egypt? I think we often ask this question, who am I? Who am I to go and do this great thing for the Lord? Or who am I to go and pursue this difficult task. And, that's a valid question. Who are we? We're nothing. Us by ourselves, that doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. However, it is God working through us that gives us purpose. Chapter 4 and verse 1, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. I think this is really common. What if they say, what if they think I'm wacko? What if they think I'm not really telling the truth? What if they think I'm making stuff up? When we think about the Church of Christ, we're very different from the denominations around us. So what if they think I'm not really from the Lord? What if they think I'm making this up or I'm some part of a cult? It's a valid question. Chapter 4 and verse 10. O Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before you, nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Moses wasn't a good talker. He wasn't good at talking to people around him. What about our own personal shortcomings? What about my personal shortcomings? What if you say that I'm not really a people person? I get really shy around people when I talk about religion, so I just don't know that I'm the right person for this. How about I'm not a good speaker? I'm not good at going up and meeting somebody for the first time, so maybe just this isn't for me. This is what Moses was saying. How does God answer these objections? Well, in chapter 12 of chapter 3 and verse 12, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. How do we know that he is going to be with us? Because he says he will be. He will be with us. It won't be us doing the work of sharing the gospel. It is God working through us. We need to stop pointing to ourselves and instead point to God. See, we're being selfish when we're saying that I can't do this. You're right. You can't do this. I can't do this. But God can if he is working through you. And then in chapter 4, Moses is shown signs from God to show that he is truly from him and that he's not making this stuff up. How do we do that? Well, we have a great sign. We have the scriptures. When we turn to the scriptures and we say, we have 100% proof that we are from God, if you just turn to the scriptures, that's our sign today. And then verses 11 and 12 of chapter 4, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore, go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say. He's going to teach Moses what to say. We have to stop doubting ourselves. Yes, we are all imperfect, and I am imperfect, and we are not going to be 100% the best evangelizer to ever walk the earth. That's not going to happen. But if we have God working through us, we are going to claim victory because it is him doing the work, not us. When we claim ignorance, there is an answer for that. If you're ignorant about something and you don't know something and you say, well, I'll have to get back to you on that, get back to them on that. Go and study it. Find out where you're wrong. Find out what you need to know and do it. Follow up. If somebody's willing to talk to you about your faith, you should take up that opportunity. Don't waste that. It's not worth it. Perhaps you say, I'm not ready. I just need a few more years and then I'll be ready to really go out and start talking to people. Okay, I understand that. But there's a pretty good answer to that. We need to practice. You need to get better. You're not going to be good the first time you talk to somebody about Christ. You have to continue to do that every day, and eventually you're going to get better, and you're going to look back and realize how bad you were. I know this is something that I often think about I know I'm going to be a lot better in a few years, but I'm not going to get a lot better if I don't practice, if I don't try now. Of course, we have to use balance. You perhaps shouldn't jump on every single occasion because it might not always be wise. But not growing is a shame. You have to grow and you have to get better at sharing your faith. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 4 through 8. For when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believe as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Minister in this passage means servant. We all have different roles, but the one thing that we can all agree on is we're all servants in this life, whether it be to sin or to God. And as servants, one of our duties to our master is to share the gospel. Now in this passage, it's talking about Paul and Apollos, and they were, of course, two men who were very good at sharing the gospel. In this church at Corinth, they had a lot of problems, and they started saying, well, I am of Apollos, and I am of Paul, and they started kind of favoring the preacher. I think we see that a lot. And that's not how it ought to be. Instead, they need to recognize that those men are simply acting as ambassadors of God. It's really not them doing anything. Now, when you plant a vineyard or some sort of crop, you're going to run into a problem. You're going to realize that you really can't do everything. You're going to need some assistance when you have a really big field. Not everybody can plant and not everybody can water. You're going to need some help. So we all have to recognize our own talents. Now, what do I mean when I say plant and water? So planting is more setting the foundation, and then watering is coming and not adding to, but helping that foundation to grow. Some people do really well at certain things, whether it be inviting somebody to church or talking to somebody when they come in the door, but you might do a lot better one-on-one. You might have to have a private Bible study, or it may just be that you just need to sit down and talk with somebody, but I might not be good at that, and that's okay. So we need to kind of learn each other and learn what we're good at, and so then we need to have some sort of balance and find out how we can all contribute to God's redemption for mankind. So we can help, of course, we can help perform these tasks, but at the end of the day, we're not going to make the plant grow. In other words, we're not going to save people on our own. We have to understand that we're not the sun. We can't give a plant life. And even though we can water, we're not the water. At the end of the day, the water is going to do it, not the one who's watering. Here's what I mean by that. John 8 and verse 12, then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. God is the light to the people who need it. We are not the ones who are filling in some sort of God role. We're not God, and that's okay. And then a plant, of course, has to have water. John 4, verses 13 and 14, Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. So even though our roles are vital towards the growth of the church, we have to understand that God will provide the increase, not us. We can look for good soil, we can do the planting, and we can make sure a plant has a nice sunny place for it to grow up. We can make sure it gets watered, but at the end of the day, we're all just servants. And that's all we are. It's God who provides the increase. And of course, people are going to harden their hearts. They're going to refuse to grow. Some plants just don't want to grow. And that's okay. We can't control that. But God always does his part. And if we do ours, we will receive that everlasting reward. Finally tonight, or closing in, I'd like to move more to some ideas, not as much in the practicality region, but more looking at our own personal faith and how we share our faith on a personal level. So I'd like to turn to a chapter that's very well known, and that's Acts chapter 8. And this is the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. And I'd like to read this in context, but I'd like to ask you a question before we read this. And you're going to have an answer, and it might be wrong, it might be right, I don't know. But I'm going to ask this question. How was the Ethiopian eunuch converted? And obviously he was converted through the word. That's not what I'm getting at. And he was converted because God provided the increase. That's true. But what was the means by which the Ethiopian eunuch was converted? Okay, let's find out. Acts chapter 8, and we're going to read verses 26 through 37. Now an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, arise and go toward the south along the road which goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is desert. So he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who had charge of all her treasury, and had come to Jerusalem to worship, was returning. And sitting in his chariot, he was reading Isaiah the prophet. Then the Spirit said to Philip, go near and overtake this chariot. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah, and said, do you understand what you are reading? And he said, how can I, unless someone guides me? And he asked Philip to come up and sit with him. The place of the scripture in which he read was this: he was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. In his humiliation his justice was taken away, and who will declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. So the eunuch answered Philip and said, I ask you, of whom does the prophet say this, of himself or of some other man? Then Philip opened his mouth, and beginning at the scripture, preached Jesus to him. Now as they went down the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, see, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized? Then Philip said, if you believe with all your heart, you may. And he answered, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And then from there he goes on his way rejoicing when he is baptized. We've read that story a lot in our lives. Most of us have. And it's a very beautiful story, yes. But I think there's a detail that we often neglect. How was the Ethiopian eunuch converted? What were the means? All it was a simple conversation. It was a Q&A. They talked about the scripture, and of course they had much more to say here, but how does this start? It starts with just a simple private Bible study. Never underestimate the power of a private Bible study. Never underestimate the power of just talking with somebody one-on-one, whether you know that person or not. If you know them, even better. I think that sometimes we underestimate how easy it is to just have a private Bible study, to just talk with somebody. And although it's going to be difficult at first, we're going to get better. And the way we do that is through practice. And then Jesus, when he talked to the woman at the well, how did the conversation start? He asked her for a drink. He said in John 4 and verse 7, give me a drink. That's all he did. Whether it be going to somebody at the restaurant and say, give me a drink, you can strike up a conversation. That works. Jesus did it, so we can definitely do it. But I tell you what, never underestimate simple conversations, simple questions, plain teaching, and a private Bible study. And that is something that every one of us can do. And finally tonight, let's talk about the danger of compromising our faith. We've talked a lot about sharing our faith, but what about maintaining in our faith? See, in a world when we don't share our faith and we don't talk to people about our religion, about Christ, we begin to become complacent. And we stop talking to people. Perhaps we even start studying. We stop thinking about God. And eventually, we are lost. Many of us people in the audience have friends and family that have left the church. When we don't share the gospel and we aren't talking about it, we may grow complacent. We may begin to compromise. And perhaps we do talk about it, but people still harden their hearts. At the end of the day, how are we going to expect to maintain our faith and not compromise or conform to a world that wants to tear us down from the inside? It's a difficult question. How are we going to keep going? How are we going to endure? Well, let's talk about a figure who did. We talked about him earlier. That's Moses. Hebrews 11, verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Moses could have had riches of royalty, the comforts of conformity, but he chose a harder life to live with God's people. It wasn't easy, I'm sure, for him, but he knew what he was going to do. He knew he wasn't going to enjoy that passing pleasure of sin. Romans 12 and verse 2, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. To conclude tonight, I want to ask everybody here, do you love your neighbor? Are you willing to share your faith with them? The church needs me, and the church needs you. It needs every single one of us. Perhaps you're here and you're not a Christian. Well, you need to be. I'm not offering the invitation right now. I'm just kind of setting up Joseph here. But we all need to come to Jesus, and we can't let the passing pleasures of sin distract us from our faith. We have to share our faith, and we have to maintain it each and every day. Is it going to be easy? No. One word, endurance. Keep going, and in the end, you will receive your reward. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.